I'm really pleased and really quite honored to have this conversation with all of you today. And thank you so much for your interest in joining in this conversation. I do also want to emphasize that it is in fact a conversation. So I want to encourage whoever wants to chime in. I will try very hard to make sure that time allows for discussion. There's just a lot to say, so I hope to be brief about it, but I do want to make sure that people who have something to contribute to this conversation from their own experience feels free to do so, because that's very meaningful to me. I do see this as a collaborative process. My name is Emelinda McSpadden. I go by all pronouns, and I am, in addition to being an associate professor of psychology at BCC, I'm also the coordinator of the LGBTQI plus resource room on our campus, which is where I am right now. So I am coming at you live from the actual space. Hi, Jared. So I am looking forward to sharing my information with you today. The title of my presentation, as I was happy to be introduced with, is LGBTQI inclusion in online learning, fostering identity and belonging in virtual landscapes. I think one of the reasons that this is really meaningful to me is because I, over the past couple of years especially, have witnessed lots and lots of people entering the fray of online teaching for the very first time. Many of us were in that boat. And as such, there was a lot to take on all at once. And this sort of focus, understandably, was not necessarily tops on people's lists of priorities, because a lot of people were just trying to figure out their tech and how their syllabus needed to change, and the ways in which they needed to differently strategize their teaching methods. But if they didn't already have these sorts of things in place, they may not have known how to accommodate for them in an online setting. So one of the things I hope to do is talk about that in specific. So in addition to talking about the kind of research that is being done on the issues specific to LGBTQI plus students in online settings, I also want to talk a little bit about some ongoing research that I'm currently engaging in that's trying to understand some of what's going on with students who are LGBTQI identified and in settings that are virtual, either hybrid or fully online. And then finally, talking a little bit about some of the recommendations that are not only coming from my own perspectives and the research that I've done so far, but from the research and findings of others in sort of an opportunity to begin this conversation. It is by no means to be considered like a fully fledged out list, because that list is ever growing as we learn more. But that's the objective for today. And the components of this presentation are basically to introduce what the problem is in specific to online learning situations, talking a little bit about the literature. And I do say a little bit because there isn't a lot of literature, and that's part of the problem, but also sort of a moment of welcome to the situation, so that people can start thinking about ways in which the literature should be grown and developed. And then I'll give a brief discussion about the research that I'm currently doing in an effort to add to that dialogue. And then finally, talking a little bit about those recommendations that I discussed earlier, just to start the conversation and provide some ideas. So first, on to the introduction, talking a little bit about what this problem is really all about. As I said before, a lot of people have started online teaching modalities for the first time not too long ago. And anybody who's done it for a while knows that it takes some time to become acclimated. I know that prior to the pandemic, I taught a good deal online. I think for, about 6 or so years prior, I had been teaching in online modalities, at least one class a semester, just to, I guess, sort of keep my hand in. So it's something that I've always been passionate about, in as much as I think it is important, especially in a community college setting, to provide that kind of opportunity for students. And so that's always sort of been something I cared about a great deal. And so I come at this from that standpoint, not necessarily like a conformed Luddite or anything like that. So just to give a sense of the way this works in an online setting, it is important to think about how it looks in an in-person setting. And the situation as such, in a broad sense, is the same in both. So whenever we're talking about like LGBTQI aware, sensitive, or aligned pedagogies, we talk about the fact that these things are happening within a context, a larger like societal context of a heteronormative and cisnormative tonalities. So to be clear about that, we see a lot of, I think you can speak on like a position of privilege as an example of how to approach discussing this issue and how it manifests. Whenever you have a classroom of students, a lot of presumptions are made about the people who are there, that is virtual and non-virtual. So if there's not been a reason previously to assume otherwise, or at least somebody thought there was no reason to assume otherwise, they might proceed using lots of heteronormative and cisnormative language, concepts. I would say that everything sort of begins with language, but it's all laden with a lot of presumptions that if they don't apply to somebody directly, or they haven't been called to question those normative standpoints, then it wouldn't even cross their minds to address it in the way that they teach, in the way that they speak, in the way that they see others. So this is the norm. And I can say that and sleep really well tonight. Like that is the norm officially. This is how it tends to go. Like I'll venture to say about 90% of the time, most people just move through the world having fairly, adequate amounts of confidence about when they see somebody who they're talking to in terms of their like manifest identity. So that takes us to this notion of heteronormativity from this sort of basic interaction like perspective. All we're saying is that most people move around with what is here described as a prevailing, pervasive, persistent, negatively consequential ideology that there are two separate genders, and that is it. And that those genders each have very specific roles that are ascribed to them, and that in addition to the roles that go with those gender norms, there is also a presumption of heterosexuality. The presumption is pervasive enough that they often become conflated, gender with sexuality. And I made an executive decision to do something a little bit differently in this presentation. Ordinarily, in a presentation like this, I would like take a moment to talk a little bit about the LGBTQI alphabet soup and sort of talk about what each of the letters means. And that's sort of my MO anyway, as I do provide safe space training on our campus. But this time around, I decided not to, because part of the messaging that I'm hoping to employ today is an invitation to people to do that kind of research on their own, to explore those things, to flex their Google, just to arm oneself actively with that information. I don't know also that I would have had the time to give if I had elected to do it. But part of the reason that is typically something that I include in my presentations, even when they're not predominantly to teach on that subject per se, is because there is a heteronormativity that I am often confronted with in these presentational settings. So taking it specifically to online learning modalities, some of the things that are often encountered by students, some of the things here obviously are going to be the sorts of things that happen in either an in-person or an online situation, but some of them happen in particular ways when online. So for example, misgendering and dead naming. Misgendering and dead naming are both specific to people who are transgender and gender non-binary, which is not something that oftentimes people will go out of their way to address if it happens to them. So plenty of people have done it and don't even know that they've done it, because the people who were affected by the misgendering will likely not have mentioned it, right? So that means that a lot of people will often go through years and years of educational experience thinking that that's never happened to them, when in fact it probably has, and can almost guarantee it has. But misgendering simply means using, for instance, gender pronouns or referring to somebody's gender in a way that isn't appropriate to somebody's identity. And then also dead naming, which means, and this is unfortunately really common, despite the fact that certainly in the CUNY system, one can go into CUNY first and change their name, regardless of whether or not that name has been legally changed. And you can be addressed by the name of your choosing. However, in some little loophole moments, you can access roster lists that actually show what we call the dead name of an individual. And so first day of class, somebody's calling roll, and if they're using one of those lists, they may dead name a student. In the case of being online, we also have, a lot of people making requests to label themselves in accordance to what they would like to be called. So all of us have our names down, and then Kate, I noticed you have your pronouns down. But what's interesting is that if somebody invites for people to include not only their chosen name, but their pronouns, it may be a bridge too far for certain individuals who are not comfortable outing themselves if their names and their gender identities don't yet align, or for whatever reason don't align. Assumptions regarding intimate partner gender is a frequent instance when you have discussing of examples in class that may refer to somebody's family members, significant others, etc., and presumptions can be made that are incorrect. Gendered language use of any kind, and that includes things like saying you guys or ladies and gentlemen, right? It's like gendered choices. Dividing people into gendered groups for making arguments. In certain classes, you might want to allow people to take perspectives from the standpoint of maleness or femaleness. Languaging that is considered othering. So this happens really frequently. A lot of times people will engage in conversations and will find themselves talking about that group of people, those folks, and it comes across as though you're talking about people who aren't in the room, and yet very well could be. And I say that proceeding with full knowledge that I make no such assumptions today. Camera on policies. This is something that I think a lot of faculty struggled with as to whether or not to have students show their faces on screen. And I think that was understandable because a lot of people just wanted insurance that their students were in fact engaging and wanted to be able to, visually affirm that. The problem with that is a lot of people were not necessarily comfortable doing so for quite some time. Sometimes if somebody is in an intimate space and is perhaps, what we would consider visually trans, it could present with some problems that can lead to bias, and somebody may feel really exposed and unprotected. You also have tacit endorsement of heteronormative, homophobic, or transphobic student speech. A lot of times when faculty are engaging students to speak their minds on certain topics and making it a safe space for any and all topics to be spoken, they may not have made it clear that some things border or are very much hate speech. And so if those things are said in the spirit of free speech, sometimes things will simply be allowed to sit in the air that are actually quite damaging. And sometimes it's because of the interest of free speech. Sometimes it's because it may be difficult to know what to say or what to do when certain conversations spark during class settings. Over-reliance on references to appearance, making assumptions of somebody's gender identity or sexual orientation based on how they look. It seems really elementary, but it's done really quite frequently in our day-to-day lives. And then, as I mentioned before, requests for on-screen name and pronoun labels. I think a lot of people make those requests in an effort to show the inclusivity that's being ordained in the classroom setting. However, that may press somebody who's not comfortable sharing their pronouns in a way that puts them in what they feel to be a dangerous situation. Yeah, Janet, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I had this Wi-Fi issue, so I think I must have missed that on-screen name pronoun labels, but I've been seeing that a lot actually at BCC and conferences that I go to, and they say, oh, put your gender pronouns. And and so I guess you just addressed it, like it's probably not a good idea to do, even though I think people think it's a good idea, but maybe it's really not. I sort of missed, I think, what you may have said earlier. I'm sorry, because my Wi-Fi crapped out.
Oh, you're fine, Janet, and thank you. No, I think that what it really comes down to is the messaging is coming from a great place, but the manner in which it's being asked of people doesn't necessarily add up. So rather than, require that people share their gender pronouns, it might be adequate to invite people to share their gender pronouns if they feel comfortable doing so, and then go one step further and set the example by offering your own gender pronouns if you feel so inclined and if you feel comfortable doing so. I think that sets the appropriate tone without making it mandatory, so that anybody who doesn't share their pronouns doesn't feel like they're sort of in a bad situation. And you can even be explicit about, it's probably good practice to be explicit about why that request is being made in that way. And just starting from the beginning saying, I invite people to share their pronouns, but I don't want anybody to think that they are forced to and it's not required. And I am choosing to share my pronouns, or I'm not choosing to share my pronouns because, right? And then that sort of sets the tone. And that is actually a really nice segue into this slide, because I think that when well-meaning folks are trying to put things in place for the purposes of creating inclusive spaces, they end up othering people, and in ways that I think are only now being addressed for the first time. And I take this to heart because some of this includes initiatives that I'm very much a part of. For example, things like, creating safe spaces and saying as much, or support groups, which I host 2 of. But, there's a difference between creating those spaces and then othering within those spaces. Safe spaces are necessary in cases where there is no other safe space. When a safe space is created as such, it highlights the fact that it's needed, which further highlights the fact that people are not safe in other spaces. And that's what makes it really unfortunate, frankly. So on the one hand, it feels like, oh, yes, well, this institution is very forward thinking. We create these situations so that students can partake in these special safe space sort of program options. However, the need for them is the problem. And so you have to step back and ask yourself, how is the wider school environment in terms of hospitable sort of policy making and climate when it comes to LGBTQI folks? And then you see the role that a safe space program might take in that context. So just to briefly give some context to the numbers we're talking about here. And this is always just a ridiculous conversation to have because we have no idea. This is a good guess, right? And I think it's kind of, I don't know, for me anyway, it's kind of a no-brainer why we don't know. For one, we're talking about a particular population of students who are of an age where they are themselves exploring their identities oftentimes. And so they don't necessarily know, and they may report differently in a year from when one collects the data. And that doesn't even include the people who are simply uncomfortable sharing that kind of data for anybody and to anybody, right? So between those things and the fact that there just aren't a lot of people collecting this kind of data. Like we don't officially, I know at BCC, we don't officially collect this data like systemically. We don't ask this of students in any formal way. In individual ask-ins, for instance, when people are doing like secondary data collection projects, that this sort of identity question may arise. But as far as institutionally, that's not something that we collect. And the Association of American Universities estimates as of 2018, 2019, that we're at about 17% who identify as G, L, or B, or A. The queer questioning sort of throws me for a loop because that can kind of be anything. But separately from that, 1.7% of undergraduate and graduate students identified on questionnaires as trans or non-binary or TGNB questioning, right? So the first bullet is about sexuality questioning. The second bullet is about gender identity questioning. Right, so those are two separate things. And that's why I sort of question the usage of queer in questioning in that first bullet, because queer can sometimes include in its bracket, right, trans and non-binary individuals. It just sort of depends on the context of where that terminology is being used. So I believe, I dug in a little bit, I believe that the AAU example in their data collection, that first bullet does specifically refer to questioning and queer when it comes to sexuality, as opposed to that second bullet, which is gender. And like I said before, these are conservative figures because it's really, really difficult to collect this information. And as far as what we know about LGBTQI students' experiences as students on college campuses, and not necessarily in online settings, we do see that students who identify as queer are more likely to experience harassing behavior, IPV instances, stalking. 20% of LGBTQ college students have reported being afraid for their physical safety while on campus due to their identity as either sexually queer or due to their gender identity as being either trans or gender non-binary or non-conforming. And then 31% of LGBTQ students of color reported experiencing what would be qualified exclusionary, intimidating, offensive, or hostile conduct. And they directly attribute that to the fact that not only are they queer identified, but they are queer people of color. So that is an important metric to consider because these particular intersectionalities put our students at the highest risk of these kinds of issues and behaviors from other students. And this is all on-campus behaviors. So keeping that in mind, certainly at BCC, the majority of the students that I serve through the resource room do fall under that category of being queer identified students of color. And as such, this is of a particular note to me. So secondarily, I want to talk about the literature, but I don't have much to say. This is an extremely nascent area of research. And when I say extremely, specific literature on this topic is so limited that in a search that I have been undertaking for easily 6 months, I've only been able to find upwards of 4 or 5 articles that have been published at all specific to the topic of online learning among LGBTQI college students. So the situation is such that we have very little work on this topic, in part because I suppose it hasn't been around that long, but it has been. Here's the thing. There have been queer students in all of these virtual classrooms for as long as there have been virtual classrooms, but there just hasn't been any studies on the matter. When there are studies on the matter, they're covering a wide swath of people within the entirety of the LGBTQI community. So you see a ton of folks basically being massed together in these research examples. Also, the findings tend to be pretty vague, in part because it's such a large umbrella, but also because I think a lot of people, in an effort to do good, and I hear that because I'm kind of in the same boat, the focus goes more to the recommendations and less to the specific findings. So the recommendations tend to be drawn from the findings in part, but because this is such a narrow scope that we're dealing with in terms of the literature, it's a very different sort of navigation, right? So I just want to talk a little bit about the fact that what we do know from the literature does give us something to work with. Many LGBTQI students do indicate wanting to be in online learning modalities more than their like heteronormative and cisnormative counterparts. Also, online curricula that do include LGBTQI narratives are making an impact on queer identified students, and they find it more gratifying to be part of that classroom discussion. And finally, it's more likely for students to take part in discussions and activities in classroom settings online whenever it is clear that understandings are endorsed by a professor or by whoever is leading activities, that this is the way we will proceed. These are some basics that you should know about LGBTQI people, and these are the rules. And if these rules are not followed, then we have to address that. That has its positive qualities. Really quickly, to talk about the research that I'm doing, sort of in follow up with what I've found so far, like everybody else, trying to understand what's going on with the experience of LGBTQI students who are engaging in online learning, specific to BCC. I started out specific to my courses, but also, I'm going to be, shortly spreading that out beyond. And it is a qualitative study looking at experience by way of analyzing interview data. And participants are LGBTQI identified. So yes, that broad umbrella, if I were to get enough numbers, I might start to specify, perhaps looking at trans specific individuals or non-binary individuals. And I'm using a critical incident method, which can be qualitative or quantitative. For my purposes, I am doing a qualitative inquiry. So I'm going to be doing sort of a critical incident method with a narrative analysis. I have done some preliminary findings based on 11 students and 11 pieces of interview data, which include both positive and negative critical incidences of online learning. So each student reported something that happened that was awful and something that happened that was affirming. I will say this much: the affirming ones were harder to come by, even though everybody did come up with something. The ones that some people came up with are kind of superficial. And beyond that, the bad ones there were more of. And we're finding that this is an example of a quote or two. This is two quotes that I'll put up here for people to see. Basically, a lot of frustration and a lot of anger, and people just not wanting to come to class. And these are the recommendations that are drawn not only from my experience, but from the experiences of other researchers who are doing work in this field so far, which I'll leave up at this point. And I know I'm out of time, but if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to entertain those at this time.